Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this online EU training webcast. My name is Gabor Mekes. I am the managing director of Arboreus, the company that operates the online EU training website. And we are going to talk about two specialist competitions that have been announced today. Both are for selecting staff for the Office or Harmonization in the Internal Market, which is a European Union institution dealing with community trademarks and so-called community registered designs. And we are going to talk about the eligibility criteria, the language requirements, the education and work experience requirements, and so on and so on. And we'll see what kind of tests and assessment and exercises you have to go through to succeed in this competition. So I'm going to ask you for just 1 second of patience until I adjust my headset, and then we'll start right away. Alright, so just a couple of words about online EU training, the website. We have over 70,000 registered users. I'm sure that some or many of you are in that 70,000. If you want to discuss anything related to EPSO competitions, the best place to go to is our Facebook page, where there are 33,000 other people with very similar interests as you. So it's a very good place to discuss details of competitions, scores, results, preparation and practice steps. What we do is we offer test packages, simulation packages for pre-selection tests that are used by the European Personnel Selection Office, and we also hold webinars where we go into details and discuss the methodologies to be successful at these tests, and also in the exercises at the assessment centers. So let's quickly overview the agenda for today, what we're going to talk about. First of all, we're going to talk about the types of positions that are available in this specialist competition, which is once again, unlike other general EPSO competitions, are only for selecting staff for the Office for the Harmonization of the Internal Market. We will see the language requirements, which are somewhat different from the usual requirements used by EPSO. We will see the education and work experience requirements, and this competition is special because in place of the usual tests that EPSO uses to select a smaller number of people from a large number of candidates, what you're going to get is a so-called talent screener, which is a form that you need to fill out upon applying for the competition, and we'll see what kind of questions there are in this talent screener and how your answers are scored. And if you're successful at gaining the necessary point or score at this talent screener, you will be invited to the assessment center, and we'll see what that will comprise. Alright, so I'm sure many of you are much more of a intellectual property experts than I am, and you already know very well what OHIM deals with, but just for completeness' sake, OHIM administers or registers and deals with so-called community trademarks, which are trademarks that are recognized in all European member states, and also registered community designs, which it can be any kind of design, like industrial design or a user interface of a piece of software or anything similar. And people who work at OHIM work on registering and administering these designs and trademarks, dealing with with complaints and oppositions to a trademark being registered, and they also keep in contact with other national offices, trademark offices, and international organizations dealing with intellectual property. So once again, the main duties that that someone would working at OHIM would deal with is examination of trademark applications and oppositions to those applications, keeping in contact with national and international authorities. And obviously the competition is for selecting staff at different levels, as we will see. So people will working at different levels, for example administrators and assistants, deal with different specific tasks, but all of the tasks have to do with these areas. So what are these positions that we're talking about? People will be selected for two levels. Administrators, who are usually university graduates working autonomously or potentially leading small teams, and they will be selected or recruited into the 86 seniority level, which is one step or one level higher than what EPSO usually selects people for more generalist positions. So for example, next spring, when EPSO will select people for all other EU institutions like the Commission, they will select people for the entry-level AD5 position. This is one step higher, which means more serious responsibilities, also higher salary, and so on and so on. And 40 people will be selected for this 86 level, which might not sound much in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of the number of EU civil servants, but considering that this is just one single institution, it's a quite a large number. So it's a very good opportunity to participate in this competition. And senior assistants, so-called AST3 assistants, will also be recruited or selected. Once again, the AST3 is a code that designates a hierarchy, a seniority level in the assistant corps, and 60 people will be selected for assistant positions or for slots on the reserve list. We'll see what the reserve list is towards the end of the webcast. So that's a total of 100 positions. Just in comparison, in a regular annual generalist AD competition, EPSO usually recruits between 270-350 people, but that goes for the needs, staffing needs of all EU institutions: the Parliament, the Commission, the Council, the European Economic and Social Committee, the Committee of the Regions, and the whole range of other institutions. So in comparison to that, 100 positions just for OHIM, it's a pretty large number, and a very good opportunity for professionals in the intellectual property area. So let's talk a little bit about the language requirements. Obviously, what EPSO refers to as language 1, which is your main language, which is usually your mother tongue, but EPSO uses this more abstract term because there are a lot of bilingual people in the EU, so it's more of a neutral term. So your main language has to be one of the official languages of the now 28 member states of the European Union. So it can be anything from Belgian to Gaelic to Croatian, Hungarian, French, Portuguese, whatever. You also have to have a second language, which is basically the working language, and this is where a difference comes in as compared to more generous competitions. In all EPSO competitions, basically the second language has to be one of English, French, or German. Also, it has to be different from your selected first language. And in the this particular OHIM competition, there are two other languages that can be selected for a second language, namely Italian and Spanish. So one of 5 languages: English, French, German, Italian, and Spanish. Now let's look at the education and work experience requirements, and this is where things will get a little bit more complicated. We have to talk about the 86 requirements and the AST3 requirements separately, because the criteria are different. Let's talk about the 86 first. When it comes to education background, you have to have, the way EPSO puts it is, completed university studies of at least 3 years, resulting in a diploma, which is basically a bachelor's degree. Any kind of diploma is accepted, so it doesn't have to be in the area of, let's say, economics or law or anything like that. Any such diploma is accepted. In addition to that, you have to have work experience, not just any kind of work experience, 3 years of work experience, and it's very important that EPSO says that that work experience has to be relevant to the duties of the 86 staff for which you are applying. Now, how do you decide if your work experience is relevant? In the notice of competition, EPSO lists the duties that 86 administrators at OHIM need to perform, and also they list so-called selection criteria. These will be used in the talent screener as well, so we'll come back to this. But if you read through these sections in the notice of competition, you'll have an idea of what EPSO, or more specifically the selection board, might find as relevant work experience. Now, when it comes to the AST3 positions, it's a slightly different system, and the difference is mainly caused by the fact that you can apply with only secondary education as a highest educational attainment. Let's take the simpler example. If you have any kind of post-secondary qualifications, be it a course, a professional course, or university studies, then the situation is simpler. You can have any kind of post-secondary qualifications. If you have that, all you need to have is, just like in the case of the 86 competition, 3 years of relevant work experience. But you also have a window of opportunity to apply if your highest educational attainment or achievement is secondary education. If you have that, any kind of secondary education will do, then you can substitute basically the university diploma for 3 additional years of relevant work experience. So once again, if you have secondary education, then you need to have 3 plus 3 years of relevant work experience. Again, how is relevancy determined? Once again, there's a separate section for the AST3 description, duties and selection criteria. If you read through those, then once again you'll have a good idea of what EPSO is looking for. Important when you navigate the notice of competition, which is not very logically structured. There's a separate section for the 86 and a separate one for the AST3. Be sure that you're reading the relevant one, the one that is relevant for the option that you selected. Okay, so let's continue. What is the process? How do we actually get one of these jobs? And this is where things get tricky a little bit. Let's see. The general process is divided into 2 phases. When you apply to the competition, you have to fill out some general information about your education background, your work experience, your language choice, whether you're applying for the 86 or the AST3 option. There are also some general motivational questions, like why would you like to work for the European Union? Describe some past achievements in your career or your professional or academic life. these are part of every EPSO application process. But since this particular competition does not have a pre-selection phase, which means that you do not have to pass verbal, numerical, and abstract reasoning tests to get to the assessment center. Instead, you have an additional extra tab in your application form, which is called the talent screener. And this talent screener can be considered as the pre-selection phase or the first phase of the competition, and we will talk a little bit more in a little bit more detail about what this talent screener looks like and what the best way is to fill this form out. Now, once the selection board determines that you've successfully passed your answers successfully conform to whatever requirements they have for these positions, we will see how your answers are evaluated and scored. But if you're successful, then you are invited to the assessment center, in which you have to participate in several exercises. You have to do some tests. We will see what these are, and if you're successful there as well, that's when your name is put on the reserve list, which we'll see what exactly that means. Alright, so let's look at the talent screener first. The talent screener is basically a form where EPSO gathers additional information about your skills and experience and qualifications. So this is where EPSO really digs deep and wants to know about concrete examples of your experience in certain aspects or factors of the job. And it's quite concrete. There are 11 selection criteria, and these are listed in the notice of competition, once again separately for AD6 and ASD3 levels. Let's see a couple of these criteria. Let's see the first one: professional experience in drafting decisions on absolute grounds for refusal of trademarks, including decisions by appeal bodies. This example is for the AD6 level. So a question formulated based on this criterion could sound like something like: do you have professional experience in drafting decisions on absolute grounds for refusal of trademarks, including decisions by appeal bodies? Another example: do you have professional experience in supervising, mentoring, and guiding other people? Or do you have professional experience in a multicultural or international environment? And your first task in filling out the talent screener is to ponder this question and then simply select yes or no. If you select no for one particular question, that's not grounds for elimination from the competition in and by itself. If you select no, then no other details will need to be provided for that particular question. If you select yes, then a new little window or entry field or little box opens, in which you'll have a chance to detail that experience in a couple of sentences, usually 1 or 2 paragraphs maximum. Now, I'm sure you agree that a lot of people will apply for these competitions. The talent screener is the first phase of the competition, which means that everyone is still there, and the selection board has a finite number of people. So that means that they will have to read a lot of these answers given to the questions in the talent screener. Why do I emphasize that? I emphasize that because this means that you have to be very concrete, very brief, and somehow even unique. You have to stand out. Now, I know it's easier said than done, but let's take an example. Professional experience in supervising, mentoring, and guiding people. If you answered yes to this question, you have, let's say, 1 paragraph to describe that experience. Don't go into describing it in 5 or 6 paragraphs, giving several examples, starting from a very general point of view. Try to find one very concrete, very relevant example. Don't say things like, I have mentored a lot of people and guided their professional development. This means nothing. This is just repeating the words in the question itself. A much better option would be to say, after being named the leader of a team, I brought on board, or I recruited someone from university and came up with a 4-week program in which I taught him or her everything that they needed to know to be a productive part of the team. I used PowerPoint presentations, one-on-one coaching sessions twice in a coffee house, and I also came up with short quizzes to see whether they learned everything that I wanted them to know to perform well in that role. Why is this answer, it's a little rough, I just came up with it, but why is this answer good? It gives a concrete example. It talks about coaching one particular person. It describes not just what you did, but how you did it. It says you used a PowerPoint presentation, you used one-on-one coaching sessions. It even mentions that you did it off-site in a coffee house, which is a nice touch. Sometimes going informal can be very effective in coaching someone. And it also mentions that you came up with quizzes to see if they learned what you wanted them to learn, which is once again a creative way of guiding and mentoring someone. This is just one experience. Is more from a training perspective. If you want to bring an example for supervising or mentoring, you have to come up with a different example. But be concrete and make it one good example. Let's see another one. Professional experience in drafting decisions on cancellation of trademarks, including decisions by appeal bodies. Once again, don't just talk in general about how many of these you have drafted. Take one example. Let's say a tricky one where I'm not an intellectual property rights expert, but try to pick an example where the cancellation process or whatever presented some challenges or tough decisions, and describe that as succinctly and as briefly as possible. And this is useful because if the selection board member sees that your answer fits into that little box, it's only 2 or 3 or maximum 4 lines long, and in the first sentence you manage to raise their curiosity, then it's half victory, and you have a much better chance of getting a high score for that answer. Alright, so let's see how are these answers to these questions scored. There are 11 selection criteria. If you select no, then obviously that will be 0 points. But if you select yes, then you can get a score from 1 to 4 to the answer that you gave. There's a different factor or aspect as well, because each criterion has a weighting as well, from 1 to 3. This means that professional experience drafting decisions about cancellations of trademark applications might have a much higher weight than professional experience working in a multicultural environment. So that means that if you scored 2 on the drafting decisions criterion, and that has a weight of 3, then your final score on that criterion will be 2 times 3, that is 6 points. Conversely, if you score 4 on the multicultural experience, but that criterion has only a weight of 1, then you'll get 4 times 1 equals 4 points for that particular criterion. And that means that the total theoretical total score that you can achieve is weight multiplied by score for each of the criterion, and all of these points summed up for all 11 criteria. The total score is unknown because we don't know how many criteria there are with a weight of 1, with a weight of 2, and with a weight of 3, but this is how the total is calculated. It's quite complex, but it's a pretty good system, and even though the talent screener itself is quite a subjective exercise by nature, because it's scored by individuals, by human beings, and not by computer algorithms. With this scoring and weighting system, they try to make something that is inherently subjective as objective as possible. Now, I have to mention here that a couple of weeks ago, the Civil Service Tribunal made a decision in a case which affected the talent screener, and we don't know how this will affect the use of the talent screener in the future, but basically one candidate raised the concern that the talent screener by nature is quite subjective, and the Civil Service Tribunal seemed to agree. EPSO appealed the decision, so we don't know what the final outcome will be, but it is very it is quite likely, or not likely, but it's possible that the use of the talent screener in future competitions might be called into question. We don't foresee this directly affecting this particular competition, so you have to make the most out of the talent screener that you can. Now, why is this total score so important? It is important because once you have your score and everybody else's score, candidates are rank ordered from the highest score to the lowest, and EPSO will draw a line at the 100th highest score for 86, and the 120th highest score for 86, and the 180th highest score for AST3, and those will be the people who will be invited to the assessment center. Why 120 and 180? The answer is that EPSO invites 3 times as many people to the assessment center as the number of positions on the reserve list. So if there were 40 positions for 86, 120 people will be invited. If there were 60 positions for AST3, 180 people will be invited for that level. Alright, so let's say you're one of the lucky who are in among those 120 plus 180 people. What happens then is that you will be invited to the assessment center. And let's continue with a discussion of what the assessment center in this particular competition entails. There are 3 areas that will be tested: your reasoning ability, your specific competencies, and by that we mean your specific knowledge and experience in intellectual property rights, and your general competencies. Sorry for the typo there. General competencies are competencies like communication skills, organizing and prioritizing skills, and some others that we will see. So what are the methods for testing your reasoning ability? As you can see, there's just no way of getting away from verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning, and abstract reasoning in an EPSO competition. So even though there is no pre-selection phase, you still will be tested using these 3 tests in the assessment center. Now, there is some good news, because all you have to do is achieve the pass mark. If you achieve the pass mark, your score will not be counted towards your final score. So it doesn't matter if you scored 100% or 55%, it doesn't matter as long as you scored higher than the pass mark. What is this pass mark? It's 10 out of 20 points for verbal reasoning, and the maximum score for numerical and abstract is 10 points each, and they are scored together, and it's again 10 out of 20 points for these 2 tests together. So if you achieve 10 for verbal reasoning and 10 for numerical and abstract together, then you can forget about these 3 tests. You passed, and your final score will be determined by all the other exercises in the assessment center. So what are these other exercises? To test your specific competencies, there's only just one exercise, which is called a structured interview. A structured interview is basically just like a normal interview. The reason it is called structured is because it has a very formal structure. All the same questions will be asked of all candidates in the same order, and this is to make it as objective and as comparable as possible. Now, this particular structured interview is based on the same questions that you answered in the talent screener. So this will be a chance for you to shine again, or to compensate for weaker answers in the talent screener. Basically, you'll have to answer the same questions as you did in the talent screener orally. Now, it's a good idea to not to give the same answers. Try to think of new examples, perhaps examples that lend themselves better to an oral presentation. But it's based quite closely on the talent screener, and that's a good thing because you can prepare for it. Now, the structured interview will be scored out of 100 points. The pass mark is 50. This means that this is the minimum you have to achieve. But unlike in the case of verbal, numerical, and abstract reasoning tests, your score in this exercise will be counted toward your final score. Namely, whatever score you achieve here will be 55% of your total assessment center score. So it's a very important interview, and it's well worth preparing for. What are the general competencies? The general competencies, I'm sure you're quite familiar with them, are analysis and problem solving, communicating, delivering quality and results, learning and development, prioritizing and organizing, resilience, which is just a fancy name for stress management, and working with others. These 7 competencies are tested in the assessment center both for AD6 and for AST3 candidates as well. If you're going for the AD6 level, there's an additional 8th competency as well, which is leadership. That's the reason. The reason for this is because even though you are selected for a relatively entry-level position, EPSOL likes to give perspective and prospect to administrators, and they like to recruit as many leaders from inside the civil service as possible. And this is why even at an entry level, leadership skills and the leadership competency is important. So how are these general competencies tested? First of all, you'll have a written test, which is usually a case study, and by case study we mean a dossier of documents that you need to read, and based on those documents you have to write an essay, a short essay summarizing the information in the document, or answering a particular question that is based on the information in the documents. This is usually related to your field, so it will probably be a topic that is related to intellectual property, but it is important to remember that this test is designed to test some of your general competencies. For example, your written communication skills, or your organizing and prioritizing skills. For example, by giving you a large number of documents to read in an effort to test whether you can prioritize among them. So even though the topic is usually relevant to your profile, this is not a test of your experience and your professional knowledge. This is a test of some of your general competencies. There will also be an E-tray exercise, which is simulating kind of like an email inbox that you might face on your first day or in your first month on the job as an administrator at OHIM. And once again, based on the emails, you either have to compose a reply email or or decide what you would do based on that email from some options that are listed or that are available. There's also a second structured interview which will test your general competencies. This is, once again, it has a very strict structure. The same questions will be asked in the same order, and these will be related to competencies like stress management, working with others, and the questions will sound something like, give us an example where you experienced stress at the workplace and how you handled it. And once again, it is a very good idea to ponder these questions and have nice, concrete complex examples that you can answer these questions with. Remember that you don't always have to answer with an example where you come out very positively. You can bring an example where you failed in something, and you can focus on what you learned from that experience. That's also a very positive way of answering a question like this. And finally, there's a group exercise which you will perform with 5 or 6 other candidates. Remember, in the assessment center, you're not necessarily competing with each other. In a group of 6, it is very well possible that all 6 of you will be selected, and especially in the group exercise, it's not possible to succeed with a competitive mindset. Rather, you should work together to collectively give the best performance and make the best impression. Alright, so let's look at the scoring of the general competencies. The scoring will not be done on an exercise by exercise basis, but rather on a competency by competency basis. So you can get 10 points for each of the 7 or 8, depending on whether you're going for the AD6 or ASD3. So 10 points for each of the 7 or 8 competencies. So that adds up to a total of 70 or 80 points. And there's a pass mark again here, 40 out of 80 for AD6 and 35 out of 70 for ASD3. Once again, this is just the minimum score you need to achieve. Your actual score given to your general competencies will be counted towards your total score, and they will count 45% of your total assessment center score. So they have roughly equal weight, but a little bit more weight is given to your specific professional experience. And the scoring system is very similar to what we saw for the talent screener. Candidates in the assessment center will be rank ordered based on their total scores, and since there are 3 times as many people in the assessment center as the number of positions on the reserve list, once the candidates are rank ordered, the first 1/3 or the top 1/3 will be selected and will be successful in the assessment center. So what happens if you are successful? Your name will be placed on the reserve list. The reserve list is simply a list of names from which OHIM can invite people to interview for concrete positions. So being on the reserve list is not 100% guaranteed to being recruited by OHIM. Now, it's been quite a while since there was a specialist competition for OHIM, so we foresee that OHIM might have a pretty high need for new colleagues. That means that at least some of the people from the reserve list will find jobs very quickly. But there's also another indication which kind of points in the different direction. The reserve list will be valid until 2017. Yes, reserve lists have a validity. They do expire, which means that if you are not recruited by 2017, you have to participate in a new competition. Now, EPSO has gotten much better in predicting the number of people needed by the EU, or in this case by OHIM. So there's a very good chance that 95% of successful candidates will be recruited quite quickly, but in the interest of full disclosure, we had to mention the validity of the reserve list is quite long, and that this is not a 100% guarantee. Alright, so just a couple of tips to close off this session about how to practice and prepare, and we have a special offer for you as well at the end. So when it comes to practicing and preparing for any kind of EPSO competition, practice, simulation, knowledge of the methodology and the rationale behind the tests and exercises, and persistence are very important. Persistence is important because all EPSO competitions, they represent a long process. Even the fastest competitions can take up to 9 months, and if you're not persistent, you might give up in the middle. So you have to be persistent. Also, many of these exercises, both the assessment center or the tests, the verbal reasoning, the numerical reasoning, or even the case study, they are by nature, you can by nature perform better at them if you're already familiar with the format, with the rationale behind them, and this is why it's important to try to simulate the conditions, the format of the exam as closely as possible. The same goes for methodology. If you know the rationale behind the test, if you know why they are used and what they measure, you can inherently perform better. And to achieve this, it's very important to practice. And we'll see how online EU training can help you with these 3 things: simulation, methodology, and practice. Now, when it comes to practice, duration is much more important than intensity. That means that it's much better to take 2 months to practice just a little bit every day than sitting down for 2 times 12 hours on the last weekend before the assessment center or before your exam. Simulation, again, many of the tests and the case study and the e-tray will be on a computer, so it's best to try to simulate it on a computer, not doing it on paper, because it gives you a different experience. Just show you a couple of examples. This is what an abstract reasoning test looks like. The top row presents you with a series of figures, and you need to figure out the rules that govern the relationship between the figures, and your job is to find the correct figure for the position of the question mark from among the options in the bottom row of the test. The verbal reasoning test is based on a text passage followed by usually the standard question: which of the following statements is correct? And you have 4 statements to evaluate and pick the one and only correct answer. And obviously a lot depends on the topic of the passage, the syntax, how long the sentences are, and the vocabulary, what kinds of verbs and words are used. But the most important factor that determines how difficult the verbal reasoning test is the types of statements that are used. And we go into a lot of detail in webinars about how to evaluate statements and how to differentiate between a statement that is correct, for example, and one that only could be correct, but it's impossible to prove it. The numerical reasoning test is usually relies on a table or a chart, or a combination of a table and a chart, and you have to read off information from the table and the chart, and then perform some simple calculations to find the correct answer. We always emphasize in webinars that the difficulty is in correctly interpreting the table and figuring out what kind of calculations you need to perform, as opposed to actually performing them, because once you've figured out what to do, the calculations themselves are usually quite easy. The case study, this is a screenshot taken from the case study simulation on online EU training. Once again, we tried to simulate the interface used by EPSO as closely as possible. You can see that the blue buttons represent documents that you can open and read, and there's an editor where you can save your essay response. Once again, let me emphasize that the topic in the real exam might be relevant for your profile, and it might not be relevant if you do a case study simulation on EU training, but the case study is there to test your general competencies, your writing skills, your prioritization skills, and this is why we believe a simulation, even based on a different topic, can be very, very useful, because it teaches you time management. It shows you what these documents that are that comprise the dossier look like, and there's one additional draw that we are very proud of, is that our case study simulations are reviewed and scored by real people, by ex-EPSO assessors, so they really know the thinking of the selection board, and their scores and their comments can be relied on in your preparation. We also offer an extensive range of statistics that you can look at in your preparation, and each of our tests, with a few exceptions, can be retaken and revised as many times as you wish, and you can even look at trend lines showing your performance and hopefully your improvement over time across different test types, which can be an important factor in keeping up your motivation and your persistence in preparing for the exams. As I mentioned in the beginning, we offer practice test packages and webinar and classroom training courses. The two test packages that are relevant for the OHIM exam is the EPSO AD AST3 case study simulation package and the EPSO AD abstract numerical verbal reasoning simulation package, which you can find on EU training. The verbal reasoning tests on EU training are available in 11 languages, which cover 85% of the population of the EU. So you are able to select your main language when purchasing the package. And finally, for the methodology of the case study and the assessment center, we offer webinars, webinar recordings, and classroom trainings as well. I recommend that you check our website for announcements on upcoming trainings. We also offer free ebooks on methodology for many of the test types, like abstract reasoning or verbal reasoning, and we have an extensive range of tips and tricks articles which can be very useful in your preparation for any EPSO exam. If you want to study offline, like on the train or on the subway, our recommended book is the Ultimate EU Textbook, which provides a lot of examples for abstract, numerical, and verbal reasoning, and describes all of the assessment center exercises as well that you will face, and it's a very practical and very handy book, and the 2013 edition is very up to date. So this was what we wanted to cover tonight. I hope this was useful, and I hope many of you will not hesitate and apply for these OHIM competitions. And I promise that we have a special offer for you. So if you decide to go for any of the practice offerings that we have on online EU training until midnight this Sunday, then use the discount code OHIM10. OHIM with all capital letters, and you can get 10% off any of our training and methodology packages, be it a webinar or a case study simulation or an abstract numerical or verbal reasoning package. So once again, OHIM10 with all caps for the word OHIM, and thank you again for participating in such large numbers, and I wish you good luck if you decide to apply, and have a good night and a good weekend. Bye bye.